Hi, so here's a fancy sounding and pretentious word to describe an arbitrary part of mapping. Some people might say I'm overcomplicating mapping, and, well, I probably am. This is the third time I've had to rewrite this script just because I haven't been happy with the definitions, but nonetheless, here we go. So here we will talk about strain. You've probably heard this word before in the term repetitive strain injury, or RSI, and to be honest, it's not that far off. In mapping, I refer to strain as the amount of work needed for a player to play a single object. Each object requires a cursor to move at some speed in order to reach it. The more speed change that is required, the more straining that object is. The main factors that affect strain are spacing, rhythm, and angles. Angles I've already talked about with linear momentum. Assuming a player snaps to each note, sharp angles means that the player needs to force their hand in one direction in order to travel to the next note, so there is only one speed change. Wide angles, on the other hand, means that the player needs to decelerate and accelerate in the same direction in order to travel to the next note, so there are two speed changes required here. More speed changes on the same amount of objects means more strain on the player. Reversing circular flow also induces some amount of strain because it goes against the angular momentum the player has. If we assume the rhythm is constant, small spacing adds little strain on each object, as the player doesn't need to reach high speeds in order to reach each note, so the speed changes are small. Increasing the spacing means higher speeds are needed to cover the larger distance, so larger speed changes are required here, and so these objects are more straining on the player. At constant spacing, objects with long gaps in time between them adds very little strain as there is a long time to cover each distance, which means the player doesn't need to reach high speeds in order to hit each object. At faster rhythms, there is less time between each note, so the player needs to cover the same amount of distance in less time, increasing the speed required and the strain on each object. As you can also imagine, a dense tapping pattern will also add strain on the player's tapping hand. So far, I've only mentioned strain caused by movement. Rhythm is unique in that it also causes strain on the tapping hand. Basically, the more the player taps, the more strain there is. Here's two ways to map the same sort of rhythm. The rhythm on the left uses higher spacing and less active notes, while the one on the right uses lower spacing but more active notes. The one on the left causes more strain on the movement hand, while the one on the right causes more strain on the tapping hand. But there's more. Strain can also be affected by where on the playfield each note is. In a relaxed state, players will leave their cursor in the middle, so they can reach each edge with similar ease. This would make notes in the centre easier to hit than notes near the edge, as the edge notes require the player to stretch in order to reach them. This can especially be the case with the first notes in the map, the first notes after a break, or the first note after a spinner, since the player needs to travel from the centre of the field in order to reach them. Another less obvious thing that affects strain is something called relative pressure. Pressure is another pretentious word that I'll cover at another time, but for now, you can think of it as intensity. Imagine a high intensity pattern, something like this, with high spacing jumps everywhere. Then all of a sudden I place this note at the end of it. This note on its own has low spacing, uses sharp angles, and therefore would have low strain on the player. However, this is placed right after a bunch of notes at high spacing, and is significantly different from the others. The player would have conditioned themselves to be playing higher intensity patterns, so throwing in an object that goes against what the player is expecting would add a lot of strain on the player as they attempt to adjust for the new different mapping style. To reduce spacing without inducing too much strain, the spacing changes could be spread over several circles or even sliders. Since strain has a lot of variables to it, it's unreasonable to give each note some sort of measurement of how straining it is. In other words, it's subjective. But it's clear to see how some objects would induce more strain than others. Basically, the more uncomfortable the movement, the more straining it is. Or if you prefer, objects with higher strain are more likely to give players RSI. Does that mean that strain is a bad thing then? Well, no, not really. It's pretty much the same as uncomfortable movement. The only difference is that uncomfortable movement refers to the map, while strain refers to the player. They're pretty much the same in that they both have their places when they're appropriate and when they're not. The most obvious way to use straining patterns would be to emphasize specific beats in the map, whether as some sort of finale or some new instrument gets introduced. It's probably also worth thinking about how often you put strain on the player. Having most of the map be straining, or inducing strain at the very specific points, are decent ways to map, as opposed to putting strain at random parts of the map. Really, strain is just an alternative way to view uncomfortable movement. I could even reuse this script if I wanted to make a video about uncomfortable movement. Probably, but I wouldn't do that.